Storm Ingrid didn't tear Britain's coastline apart in one dramatic moment. Instead, it did something far more disturbing. It pushed the entire country right up to the edge, past the point engineers, planners, and emergency managers quietly assume will never be crossed. Along the coast, seawalls didn't fail. They barely survived. Waves climbed to nearly 40, even 50 feet high, stopping just short of overtopping defenses that were designed decades ago for a climate that no longer exists. Rail lines were shut down not because they were destroyed, but because officials knew they were minutes away from being ripped apart. Bridges were closed not after collapse, but because one more gust, another 90 or 100-mile-per-hour blast, might have tipped them into disaster. In some regions, the power grid stayed online by margins measured in minutes and megawatts. From the outside, it looked calm, controlled, responsible. But that calm was an illusion. What the public saw as precaution was actually infrastructure operating at its absolute limits. This is the side of extreme weather we rarely talk about. Not the dramatic rescues, not the collapsed buildings, but the invisible thresholds. The moment when floodwater is inches from a control room door, when wind loads are pounds away from snapping transmission towers, when a single delayed decision could turn a closure into a mass casualty event. Storm Ingrid exposed how modern safety really works, not by being unbreakable, but by holding together just enough. And that's the problem. Storms are getting stronger, faster, less predictable. But the safety margins built into our infrastructure aren't growing with them. For American viewers, this shouldn't feel distant. Our coastlines rely on the same assumptions, the same aging defenses, the same belief that it'll hold one more time. Storm Ingrid didn't cross the line, but it showed us how close that line really is. And next time, we may not stop inches short. Our rail corridors run alongside rising seas. Our power systems trade resilience for efficiency, and we rely on the idea that there's still room for error, space between danger and disaster. Storm Ingrid showed just how thin that space has become. It wasn't the storm that broke Britain's systems. It was the realization that next time those margins might not exist at all. Every major piece of infrastructure is built around an assumption that the worst conditions it will face are known, measurable, and rare. Engineers call this a safety margin, the buffer between normal operation and failure. Seawalls are designed for a specific wave height. Bridges are rated for defined wind loads. Power grids are balanced to meet forecast demand plus a calculated reserve. Storm Ingrid didn't overwhelm those systems outright. It pushed straight into the margins they were built around. Along Britain's coastline, defenses designed decades ago were suddenly facing wave energy near the top of their tolerances. Waves approaching 40 to 50 feet high didn't need to fully overtop seawalls to become dangerous. Repeated impacts drove force into foundations, joints, and aging materials. Stress those structures were never meant to absorb again and again in such a short window. Nothing collapsed, but everything was strained. The same pattern played out inland. Rail services were suspended not because tracks failed, but because wind gusts nearing 100 miles per hour pushed operations past safe limits. Another hour of exposure could have meant derailments or permanent structural damage. Power operators rerouted electricity and shed load to prevent cascading failures. The grid stayed online by narrowing its operating window, by reducing flexibility to survive. This is how modern systems endure extreme weather. Not by being stronger, but by becoming tighter. Each precaution, every shutdown, delay, or reroute lowers risk in one place while increasing pressure somewhere else. Storm Ingrid revealed a fragile truth. Our infrastructure didn't fail, it ran out of margin. And in a world where extreme weather is accelerating, that margin may be the first thing we lose. That approach works, but only for a while. For American viewers, this idea matters more than we might like to admit. From coastal highways in California to rail lines along the Northeast Corridor, U.S. infrastructure is built on the same assumptions. We don't design for the absolute worst imaginable conditions. We design for what we believe is reasonable. Storm Ingrid forced a hard reckoning with that belief. It showed that infrastructure doesn't have to collapse to reveal how vulnerable it is. Sometimes coming dangerously close is the warning, a signal that the safety margins we rely on are thinner than we ever planned for. To many people watching from the outside, the response to Storm Ingrid looked excessive. Trains were canceled before tracks were damaged. Bridges were closed while they were still standing. Ferries were tied up in harbor hours before the largest waves arrived. From a distance, it looked disruption without destruction. In reality, those decisions are exactly why the disaster didn't escalate. Modern emergency management is built around one hard lesson, learned again and again. Once infrastructure fails, control is lost. During Storm Ingrid, authorities shut systems down not because they had already broken, but because they were approaching conditions where failure would be sudden and uncontrollable. Coastal rail lines were suspended before waves could undermine the trackbed. High-profile bridges were closed as crosswinds approached 90 to 100 miles per hour, strong enough to overturn trucks and destabilize vehicles. Ports and ferries stopped operating long before seas reached their peak. These choices come with real costs. Supply chains slow down, commuters are stranded, businesses lose money. That's why these decisions are often questioned after the fact. But prevention only looks unnecessary when it works. For Americans, this trade-off should feel familiar. It's the same logic behind hurricane evacuations, wildfire-related power shutoffs, and preemptive highway closures. One delayed freight train is an inconvenience. One train caught on an exposed rail line during a storm surge could be catastrophic. Storm Ingrid didn't just test Britain's infrastructure. It exposed the thin line modern societies walk every time we choose to act before failure instead of after it. Storm Ingrid made one thing clear. Disaster safety now depends on acting earlier, not rescuing later. As storms intensify faster, the window for decision-making keeps shrinking. Waiting for visible damage is no longer an option. The uncomfortable truth is that resilience doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like empty train platforms, closed highways, and silent coastlines. Storm Ingrid didn't just test physical infrastructure, it tested whether leaders were willing to act before the margins disappeared. It also exposed a reality emergency planners understand well, but the public rarely sees. A single storm can create two very different emergencies at the same time. Along the coast, the danger was obvious: violent winds, towering waves, and storm surge. In those environments, risk arrives fast. Wind gusts nearing 100 miles per hour drive water directly into defenses, and if failure happens, it happens suddenly. That's why coastal closures come early and without hesitation. But inland, Storm Ingrid became a different kind of threat. After days of earlier rainfall, the ground was already saturated. It took just 1 to 2 additional inches of rain to overwhelm drainage systems, swell rivers, and turn low-lying roads into impassable channels. This split risk puts enormous strain on response efforts. Crews positioned for coastal impacts can't also manage inland flooding at the same time. Equipment built for high wind emergencies isn't always suited for water rescues, and transportation routes that remain open near the coast may be closed farther inland due to standing water, landslides, or washouts. The storm doesn't move as a single front, it fractures into overlapping crises. American viewers will recognize this pattern immediately. Hurricanes that strike the Gulf Coast often cause their deadliest flooding hundreds of miles inland. Nor'easters hammer the shoreline while dumping rain and snow far from the ocean. The danger isn't confined to the forecast cone, it spreads. Storm Ingrid showed how planning based on fixed geography can fail when storms no longer respect boundaries. And as extreme weather continues to evolve, the ability to see and act on that reality may matter more than any seawall or bridge ever could. Coastal communities prepared for storm surge, inland regions braced for heavy rain, but the real pressure point emerged where water, wind, and mobility collided. Not at the dramatic edge of the coastline, but in the overlooked spaces between regions, where safety margins thin the fastest. Storm Ingrid wasn't just testing physical defenses, it was testing coordination, whether systems built to handle separate threats could still function when those threats arrived at the same time. When a storm doesn't completely destroy infrastructure, it creates a different kind of damage, one that's harder to see but just as costly. Storm Ingrid left many systems standing but operating at reduced capacity, and that partial failure carried consequences far beyond the coast. Rail corridors reopened slowly, often under strict speed limits. That forced delays across national rail networks. Freight shipments arrived late or didn't arrive at all. Fuel deliveries were rescheduled. Perishable goods sat idle. Each delay fed into the next, turning hours of disruption into days of backlog. For industries that depend on precise timing, manufacturing, fishing, tourism, the losses added up quickly. Coastal economies felt it first. Fishing fleets stayed tied up in Harbour, not because ports were destroyed, but because conditions remained unsafe. Charter operators and seaside businesses lost critical revenue during what should have been peak seasonal periods. Inland, factories slowed or paused production as workers struggled to commute and essential components failed to arrive on time. This wasn't destruction, it was friction, and friction is expensive. Power systems tell the same story. Keeping the grid online during extreme conditions requires constant load balancing, rerouting, and controlled shutdowns. That stability comes at a price. Backup systems run longer than intended, maintenance gets delayed, temporary fixes remain in place, and repairs postponed during the storm create weaknesses that linger long after skies clear. The system survives, but weaker than before. For American viewers, this pattern should sound familiar. It's what happens after hurricanes, winter storms, heat waves, and wildfires. The headlines fade, but the hidden costs continue to build. Storm Ingrid showed that resilience isn't just about whether infrastructure stays standing.
It's about how much capacity we lose, even when it does. After major winter storms, hurricanes, or heat waves, the most lasting damage often isn't what makes the evening news. It shows up weeks later, in delayed construction projects, higher prices, missed paychecks, lost income that never fully returns. When systems operate too close to their limits, recovery isn't a clean return to normal. It's a slow recalibration. Storm Ingrid made that clear. Resilience isn't free. Staying intact during extreme weather requires trade-offs, and those trade-offs ripple outward. The storm didn't collapse the economy, but it strained it. And as storms become more frequent, those hidden costs begin to stack up in ways no single repair bill can capture. But Storm Ingrid's most important lesson had nothing to do with wave height or wind speed. It had to do with time, or more accurately, the lack of it. This storm didn't slowly build toward danger. It intensified fast, compressing the window for preparation. Forecasts updated, warnings escalated. Decisions had to be made faster than many systems were designed to move. That mismatch between how quickly storms evolve and how slowly large systems react is becoming one of the most serious risks in modern disaster management. Infrastructure planning assumes lead time. Rail crews need hours to secure lines. Utilities need time to stage repair teams. Emergency managers need space to communicate clearly with the public. Storm Ingrid erased much of that margin. By the time its true strength was clear, many systems were already operating defensively, reacting instead of preparing. This challenge should sound familiar to American audiences. Rapidly intensifying hurricanes in the Gulf, fast-forming nor'easters along the East Coast, sudden atmospheric river events in the West. Forecasts are getting better, but storm acceleration is improving faster. Decisions that once had a full day now have hours, sometimes less. And when storms move faster than response systems, even well-designed infrastructure struggles, not because it's outdated, but because it's procedural. Large systems depend on coordination, approvals, and staged actions. Speed exposes those limits. Storm Ingrid didn't overwhelm Britain through sheer force. It pressured the system by accelerating the timeline. It asked questions faster than answers could be organized. And while the system held, it did so narrowly. The takeaway is simple and unsettling. In the future, resilience may depend less on how strong our infrastructure is and more on how fast we're willing to act. The next generation of resilience won't be defined only by stronger walls or taller barriers. It will be defined by faster decisions, more flexible responses, and systems designed to operate under shrinking timelines. Because in a world where storms arrive sooner and intensify faster than expected, time itself has become the most fragile margin of all. Storm Ingrid didn't leave behind the kind of destruction that fills history books. No cities were erased, no single moment of collapse defined the event. And that's exactly why this storm matters. What Ingrid revealed was something quieter and far more unsettling. How close modern systems now operate to failure. Seawalls held by feet, not yards. Rail lines shut down just in time. Power grids stabilized within razor-thin thresholds. These weren't signs of strength. They were warnings. Warnings that the margins we depend on are thinning. For American audiences, this isn't a distant problem. Our coastlines face the same pressures. Our infrastructure relies on the same assumptions about timing, intensity, and probability. We assume storms will intensify slowly enough for response plans to activate, that defenses will hold long enough for help to arrive, that systems won't all be tested at once. Storm Ingrid challenged every one of those beliefs. The question going forward isn't whether storms will become more intense. That trend is already clear. The real question is whether our systems can adapt to speed. Can we make decisions faster than storms can escalate? Can infrastructure operate safely with less room for error? And can communities remain resilient when disruption becomes routine, not rare? These aren't questions for the future. They're questions for right now. If this breakdown helped you see extreme weather through a different lens, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who lives in a storm-prone region. Awareness is one of the few tools that spreads faster than recovery. And if you want more in-depth analysis on major storms, infrastructure stress, and how close our systems are to their limits, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Now we want to hear from you. Which margin do you think runs out first? Our infrastructure or our decision-making? Let us know in the comments below.